The dust of the Arizona Territory held 1,000 stories, most buried with the bones of those who lived them. But some refused to die. This is the story of a lone woman, a town gripped by fear, and a choice that would echo through the canyons of history. It's the tale of a doctor from the East, armed with little more than conviction, of a wounded Apache warrior, already condemned by the color of his skin, and of the ruthless U.S. Marshal who gave her an ultimatum: step aside or die with him. She stood between a man's life and a firing squad's rifles, and what happened in those next desperate hours became a frontier legend. The heat in Redemption Gulch was a physical entity. It shimmered off the hard-panned street, clung to the raw timber of the storefronts, and baked the very silence of the afternoon into a brittle, oppressive thing. It was a silence Dr. Selina Parker had come to know well in the 2 years since she'd traded the civilized clamor of Philadelphia for the ragged edge of the world. Here silence wasn't peace. It was a held breath waiting for the next eruption of violence that was as certain as the sunrise. On that Tuesday in August of 1883, the eruption began, not with a gunshot, but with the frantic pounding of a child's fists on her infirmary door. "Dr. Parker! Dr. Parker, come quick!" Selina, her hands smelling of carbolic soap as she cleaned her instruments, swung the door open. Young Timothy O'Connell, the blacksmith's boy, stood there, his face pale under a spray of freckles, his chest heaving. "It's Pa. A horse threw him. His leg. It ain't right, ma'am. It ain't right at all." Without a word, Selina grabbed her worn leather medical bag. "Show me Timothy." The scene at the smithy was a familiar tableau of frontier calamity. Big John O'Connell, a man who could shoe a draft horse with one hand, lay on a bed of straw, his face slick with sweat, his teeth gritted against a pain that contorted his powerful frame. The angle of his left leg below the knee was sickeningly wrong. Selina knelt, her movements calm and economical, a stark contrast to the panicked energy of the onlookers. "Someone get me a bucket of the cleanest water you have, and whiskey, a lot of it." She worked with a focused intensity that always set her apart. She was an anomaly in this land of hard men and harder women. An educated physician, a woman who spoke of germs and sanitation, who chose to practice here after a personal tragedy in the East, had made the anonymity of the frontier seem like a balm. The townspeople respected her skill, but they watched her with a certain distance, as if she were a rare bird that had landed in their dusty chicken coop by mistake. As she was setting the compound fracture, a task that required all her strength and O'Connell's whiskey-fueled stoicism. A new sound cut through the grunts of pain and the murmur of the crowd, the rhythmic, disciplined beat of approaching horses. This wasn't the lazy gait of cowboys or prospectors. This was cavalry, or something like it. Into the dusty sunlight rode a column of 6 men. They were not army regulars. They wore a mix of civilian clothes and government-issue gear, but they rode with a chilling uniformity. At their head was a man who seemed carved from the harsh landscape itself. He was tall and ramrod straight in the saddle, with a severe, clean-shaven face and eyes the color of a winter sky. A silver star was pinned to his vest, gleaming with an authority that felt colder than any sheriff's badge. This was U.S. Marshal Silas Kane, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones from the saloons of Prescott to the lonely ranches of the Tonto Basin. He was known as a finisher. When the army couldn't pacify a region, when outlaws grew too bold, they sent for Kane. He didn't bend the law. He was the law, sharp and unyielding. Kane reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the small town as if it were a map of tactical weaknesses. His men fanned out their hands, resting near their holsters, their expressions grim. One of his deputies, a weaselly man named Pike, dismounted and strode toward the smithy. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung comfortably over his belt and whose approach to law enforcement favored negotiation over gunplay, met him halfway. "Marshal Kane," Brody said, his voice laced with a caution that bordered on unease. "Didn't expect you in Redemption Gulch. We're not here for a social call, Sheriff." Pike sneered, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "We're tracking a murderer, an Apache buck, name of Dawson. He and his band jumped a supply wagon bound for Fort McDowell 2 days back. Killed 3 men. We trailed him this far." A wave of fear, potent and immediate, rippled through the onlookers. The Apache Wars had left deep scars on the territory. To the settlers of Redemption Gulch, the word Apache was synonymous with terror, with midnight raids and brutal unseen death. Selina, her work on John O'Connell's leg finished, was wrapping it in clean linen. She heard the words, and a familiar knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She had seen the aftermath of raids, but she had also treated the victims of unprovoked attacks on peaceful native encampments. She knew that truth in this land was often the first casualty of fear. "He's wounded," Marshal Kane's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs. "One of the teamsters got a shot off. He'll be looking for water, maybe a place to hide. $100 in federal gold for anyone who provides information leading to his capture." The promise of money sent a different kind of energy through the town. Eyes darted, neighbors assessed one another. $100 could change a family's fortunes overnight. Selina finished her work and stood wiping her hands on a rag. She gave instructions to O'Connell's wife on how to care for him, her voice low and reassuring. But her mind was racing. As she walked back toward her infirmary, she took a slightly longer route, her eyes scanning the alleyways and the scrub brush at the edge of town. It was a habit born of a physician's instinct, always observing, always looking for the subtle signs of trouble. That's when she saw it. Behind the livery, near the mesquite grove that bordered the creek bed, a small, dark red stain on a pale gray rock. It was fresh. She glanced around. The street was abuzz with Kane's arrival. No one was watching her. Driven by a curiosity that overrode her fear, she followed the faint trail. A drop here, a smear on a cactus leaf there. The trail led her down into the relative cool of the creek bed, a shallow, sandy wash shaded by cottonwoods. And there, slumped against the roots of a gnarled tree, was a man. He was Apache. His black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and his face, though etched with pain, was proud and aquiline. He wore buckskin breeches and worn moccasins. His chest and shoulder were a dark, sodden mass of blood, a makeshift bandage of torn cloth pressed against the wound. In his lap lay an old single-shot rifle. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was dying. This was him. This had to be Dasan, the murderer. For a moment, Selina froze. Every story, every warning, every ingrained fear screamed at her to turn and run, to raise the alarm and claim the $100. This man was the boogeyman of the frontier, the savage killer Marshal Kane had described. But then her training took over. She saw not an Apache, but a patient. She saw a catastrophic chest wound, the telltale signs of a punctured lung, the pallor of massive blood loss. She saw a human being in agony slipping away. The Hippocratic oath she had taken in a pristine Philadelphia lecture hall had not included geographical or racial exemptions. First, do no harm. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. The man's eyes snapped open. They were black, bottomless, and filled with a defiant fire that even his grave injury could not extinguish. His hand, slick with his own blood, tightened on the rifle. A low growl, more animal than human, rumbled in his chest. Selina held up her empty hands. "I am a healer," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "A doctor! You are badly hurt. Let me help you." He watched her, his gaze missing nothing. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her tone. He saw the medical bag in her other hand. His eyes narrowed in a silent, agonizing debate. To trust this white woman could be a trick, a path to a rope or a bullet, but to refuse her help was certain death. Slowly, agonizingly, his grip on the rifle loosened. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the permission Selina needed. She knelt beside him, the physician in her overriding everything else. "This is going to hurt," she said, softly, more to herself than to him. She gently peeled back the crude bandage. The wound was worse than she feared. A bullet, likely a heavy caliber .45, had torn through his pectoral muscle and lodged deep in his shoulder, dangerously close to the lung. He needed surgery, and he needed it now. "You can't stay here," she whispered. "They are hunting you. The whole town." She looked back towards the street. She could hear Kane's voice, organizing a search party. Time was running out. She made a decision, a reckless, career-ending, potentially life-ending decision. "Can you walk?" she asked. He responded with a grimace, pushing himself up with his one good arm, and immediately collapsing back with a gasp of pain. "All right," Selina said, her mind working with frantic clarity. "All right." She slung her bag over her shoulder. She looped his good arm over her own, taking on a significant portion of his weight. He was surprisingly heavy, all lean muscle and bone. "Come on. We have to go. My infirmary. It's the only chance." He grunted, his breath hot, and labored against her ear. Together they began the torturous, stumbling journey out of the creek bed. They moved from shadow to shadow, using the livery stable and the water trough as cover. Every step was a gamble. Every distant shout was a jolt of terror. The infirmary, a small, freestanding adobe building at the quiet end of the street, seemed a mile away. They made it to the back door unseen. Inside, the familiar scent of antiseptic and clean linen was a sanctuary. She helped him onto the examination table, his blood immediately staining the white sheet. He collapsed onto his back, his body shuddering. Selina bolted the back door. Then she walked to the front door, her legs trembling, and slid the heavy iron bolt across. She drew the curtains over the windows, plunging the room into a dim, dusty light. For a moment, she leaned against the door. Her eyes closed, the magnitude of what she had just done crashing down on her. She was harboring a fugitive, a man accused of murder, a man hunted by the most relentless marshal in the territory. A sharp rap on the front door made her jump. "Dr. Parker!" It was Pike's grating voice. "Marshal Kane wants a word with everyone." "Open up." Selina's blood ran cold. She looked at the Apache on her table, his life literally in her hands. She looked at the bolted door, the only thing separating them from the firing squad that would surely be his fate. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and unbolted it. opening it just a crack. "I'm with a patient," she said, her voice remarkably calm. Pike peered at her suspiciously. "The marshal is addressing the town in front of the saloon. Your presence is required." "As soon as I am able," Selina replied, her tone firm. "My patient's well-being comes first. That is the oath I took." Pike hesitated, unused to being defied, especially by a woman. But something in her unwavering gaze made him back down. "See that you are," he grumbled, and stalked away. Selina closed and rebolted the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She turned back to the Apache. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain, suspicion, and something else she couldn't quite read. She knew with chilling certainty that this was just the beginning. Kane would not be deterred for long. The hunt would intensify. The town would be turned inside out, and her small infirmary had just become the most dangerous place in the entire Arizona Territory. She had made her choice in the creek bed, and now the consequences were barricaded inside with her. The world outside the infirmary walls shrank, then vanished. Selina's universe was now defined by the dim, dusty light filtering through the drawn curtains, the metallic smell of blood, and the ragged, shallow breaths of the man on her examination table. Time ceased to be measured by the sun, and became a desperate count of heartbeats, his and her own. "I need to get the bullet out," she said, speaking aloud to steady her nerves. "It's festering." The Apache Dasan watched her every move. He had not spoken a word, communicating only through the intensity of his gaze and the tight set of his jaw. He was a cornered wolf, and she, for now, was the only thing standing between him and the hunters. She stoked the small stove in the corner, setting a pot of water to boil. She laid out her instruments on a clean cloth, a scalpel, forceps, probes, and a silver cauterizing iron. The sight of them made him tense his hand, instinctively moving toward the knife, still sheathed at his belt. Selina stopped and met his eyes. "I know this is frightening," she said softly, "but if this bullet stays in the poison will spread. You will die, slowly, and in great pain." She picked up the bottle of laudanum. "This will help with the pain. It will make you sleep." He stared at the bottle, then back at her. The deep lines of distrust were etched around his eyes. To his people, a potion that brought on sleep was a trickster's tool, a weapon of the enemy. It meant vulnerability. It meant death. He shook his head, a single sharp gesture. He then tapped his chest with his good hand and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly from pain and disuse. The words were Apache, guttural and strange to her ear, but the meaning was unmistakable. "I will stay awake." Selina felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. It was respect. He was choosing to endure the full, unmitigated horror of her work rather than surrender his consciousness. "All right," she nodded, her own resolve hardening. "Whiskey, then. And something to bite on." She poured a generous measure of rye into a tin cup. He drank it in 2 long swallows, his eyes watering but his expression unchanged. She handed him a thick piece of folded leather. He placed it between his teeth. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice now pure physician. "This is it." The next 20 minutes were a descent into a private hell. Selina probed the wound, her delicate instruments, searching for the shard of lead buried deep within his flesh. Dasan's body went rigid. Sweat beaded on his forehead and poured down his temples. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. A low, continuous groan escaped through the leather gag, a sound of such profound agony that it seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. But he did not cry out. He did not move. His eyes, burning with a feverish light, remained locked on hers, challenging her, trusting her, hating her. Selina worked through the haze of his pain, her own sweat dripping into her eyes. She felt the scrape of metal on metal. "I have it," she breathed. With a final agonizing twist of the forceps, she pulled the misshapen lump of lead free. It was flattened and ugly, a harbinger of death that she now held in her hand. Dasan's body went limp, the tension releasing in a great shuddering wave. He was conscious, but barely. The ordeal had taken almost everything he had left. Now came the most dangerous part. Using a heated probe, she cauterized the wound, the sizzle of flesh, and the acrid smell filling the small room. He convulsed once, a sharp, involuntary jerk, and then lay still. She cleaned the area, packed it with gauze soaked in carbolic acid, and bandaged it tightly. His breathing was still shallow, but it was steadier. The immediate threat of bleeding out was over. Now the battle against infection and fever would begin. Outside the town was a powder keg. Marshal Kane, enraged by the defiance of the town doctor and the disappearance of his quarry, had effectively placed Redemption Gulch under martial law. His deputies, led by the officious Pike, went door to door. They searched barns, cellars, even the church belfry. Their methods were rough, their questions, accusations. Sheriff Brody protested, his face flushed with indignation. "Marshal, these are good people. You can't treat them like criminals." Kane rounded on him, his voice like cracking ice. "There is a killer hiding among your good people, Sheriff. That makes one of them a liar, and the rest of them potential accomplices. I will tear this town apart, board by board, until I find him. Anyone who impedes this investigation will be arrested for harboring a federal fugitive." The threat hung in the air, thick and choking. The townspeople, already fearful of the Apache, were now terrified of the law. Friendships frayed. Suspicion, like a foul weed, took root. Jedediah, the store owner, peered from behind his counter, watching Pike rifle through a sack of flour, his mind calculating the cost of loyalty. Father Michael stood on the steps of his chapel, his Bible in hand, a silent rebuke to the armed men desecrating his sanctuary. In the saloon, black-eyed Susan, a woman who missed nothing, polished glasses and listened, filing away every whispered rumor, every nervous glance. The infirmary remained an island of tense silence in the storm. Selina knew it was only a matter of time before Kane's attention focused squarely on her. Her initial rebuff of Pike had been a temporary shield, but it had also painted a target on her back. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody orange shadows across the street, Dasan's fever began to climb. He thrashed in a delirium, muttering in his native tongue. Selina bathed his forehead with cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea, a frontier remedy for fever, between his cracked lips. In his delirium, words and names tumbled out. Chiricahua, Goyakla, Nana, Loco, names of people and places. But then a phrase repeated over and over, laced with urgency, Nakedelan, Nakedelan, and then in broken, heavily accented English, white eyes, lies. Selina leaned closer. What lies? Who lies? His eyes fluttered open. The fever-bright gaze seemed to look right through her. "Wagon! Not us! Nakadelan!" He lapsed back into the Apache tongue, his body racked with shivers. A seed of doubt planted in the creek bed began to sprout in Selina's mind. What if he wasn't part of the raiding party? What if he had been there for another reason? The name he repeated, Nakedelan, meant renegades, or they who are outcast. A heavy boot thumped against the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was a summons. Dr. Parker. This is Marshal Kane. Open this door. Now. Selina's heart leaped into her throat. She looked at Dasan, delirious and utterly helpless. There was no hiding him. The room still smelled of blood and burnt flesh. She was trapped. She walked to the door, her mind a frantic blur. She could not lie not well enough to fool a man like Kane. But the truth would be a death sentence for the man on her table. She unbolted the door and opened it to face the marshal. He stood on her doorstep, flanked by Pike and another deputy. His face was a mask of cold fury, his winter eyes boring into her. "My patience has expired, Doctor," he said, his voice dangerously low. "My men tell me you were seen near the creek bed this afternoon, right where we lost the Apache's trail. You then barricaded yourself in here and refused to cooperate. You will now explain yourself." Selina drew herself up to her full height, which still felt diminutive before the towering marshal. "I am a physician, Marshal. My work is private, and my duty is to my patient. It is a duty that does not concern you." Kane's lip curled into a sneer. "Everything in this town now concerns me. I have a federal warrant to search any and all premises for a fugitive. Are you going to step aside, or will my men have to remove you?" This was it, the moment of truth. Behind her in the shadows, a man's life hung in the balance. Before her stood the unmovable object of the law. "You are not welcome in my infirmary without my permission," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "That," Kane said, his eyes glinting, "is permission enough for me." He gestured to his men. "Pike, take her." Pike reached for Selina's arm, a smug look on his face. But before he could touch her, Selina did the one thing they never expected. She stepped back inside, slammed the heavy oak door shut, and threw the bolt. The solid thunk echoed in the sudden silence. Then she did something more. She dragged a heavy bookshelf laden with medical texts from Philadelphia and braced it against the door. Then a chair. Then a small table. Outside, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by Kane's roar of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are under arrest for aiding and abetting a federal fugitive. You have sealed your own fate, woman." A thunderous crash shook the door as a deputy slammed his rifle butt against it. And then another. Selina backed away from her makeshift barricade, her chest heaving. She looked at Dasan, who had been jolted from his delirium by the noise. His eyes were lucid now, and he understood exactly what was happening. He understood the sacrifice she was making. From his belt, he drew his knife, not as a threat to her, but as a tool. He pointed with it to the old rifle lying on the floor where she'd left it. Then he pointed to the front window. Selina stared, horrified. "No, I am not a killer." He shook his head, wincing from the effort. He pointed to the window again, then made a gesture of breaking something. Not shooting at them. Creating a deterrent. A standoff. The wood of the door splintered. Another crash and a crack appeared. They would be through in minutes. With trembling hands, Selina picked up the heavy rifle. It felt alien and sinister. She had dedicated her life to mending bodies, and now she held a tool designed only for breaking them. She crept to the front window, peering through a slit in the curtain. She could see Kane directing his men, his face livid in the twilight. "Break it down!" he bellowed. Taking a deep breath, Selina pointed the rifle barrel toward the sky and pulled the trigger. The explosion inside the small room was deafening. The kick of the rifle nearly tore it from her grip, slamming the stock into her shoulder and sending a shock of pain up her arm. Outside, everything stopped. The pounding on the door ceased. Kane and his men froze, spinning around to stare at the infirmary. A warning shot. The line had been crossed. This was no longer an investigation. It was a siege. In the ensuing silence, Selina's voice, amplified by sheer terror and adrenaline, rang out into the street. "He is my patient, under my care. The next shot will not be aimed at the sky. Leave us be." A gasp went through the townspeople, who had gathered at a safe distance to watch. The quiet, reserved doctor from the east had just declared war on a U.S. Marshal. Kane stared at the infirmary, his face unreadable. Then a slow, chilling smile spread across his lips. This was a language he understood far better than legal arguments or moral pleas. "Fine," he called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "Have it your way, Doctor. We'll see how long your newfound courage lasts when the sun comes up. We'll see how brave you are when you're out of water, out of food, and staring down a firing squad." He turned to Pike. "Surround the building. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out. If she so much as opens a curtain, shoot to kill." As night fell, a ring of steel closed around the small adobe building. Inside, Selina Parker stood in the darkness, the rifle smoke stinging her eyes, her body trembling with the aftershock of what she had done. She had stood between a wounded man and a firing squad, and in doing so, she had placed herself squarely in their sights. The legend had begun, written in gunpowder and defiance, in the heart of a town holding its breath. The night pressed in on the infirmary, a living thing thick with menace and the weight of Marshal Kane's promise. Every gust of wind rattling the window frames sounded like furtive footsteps. Every creak of the old adobe was the prelude to a splintering door and a final fatal rush. Inside, Selina and Dasan were prisoners in a fortress of their own, making the world reduced to the threatening shadows beyond the drawn curtains. Selina's shoulder throbbed with a deep purple ache where the rifle stock had slammed into her, a constant, painful reminder of the line she had crossed. She was no longer just a physician, bound by an oath. She was an armed combatant who had defied federal law. Dasan was weak, the fever from his wound clinging to him like a suffocating shroud, but his mind was sharp. The shared explosive violence of the warning shot had forged a strange unspoken bond between them. He watched her from the examination table as she checked his dressing, his dark eyes communicating a depth of understanding that transcended their separate languages. "They will not wait for the sun," he rasped, his voice strained but stronger than before. "A man like Kane, his pride is a hungry animal. He must feed it." "He thinks you're a murderer," Selina said, her hands busy reloading the single-shot rifle, a futile, symbolic gesture that made her feel marginally less helpless. "He said you attacked a supply wagon, killed 3 men. Dasan struggled to push himself up on his good elbow, his face a mask of pain and profound contempt. "Kane's men find a wagon. They find dead White Eyes. They find Apache tracks. For a man like him, the story writes itself. The truth is an inconvenience." He shook his head, a bitter, weary motion. "My tracks were there, yes. But I was not with the raiding party. I was hunting them. Selina stopped the rifle forgotten in her lap. Hunting them why? They are nake de lan, he said the Apache word sharp with disgust. Outcasts, renegades. They follow their own law of greed and blood, led by a man named Chato. He is a ghost who brings the whirlwind, and he brings shame upon the name of the Chiricahua. Dasan's gaze was fierce, burning with a fire that held the fever at bay. My chief sent me to stop them before their violence brought the blue-coat soldiers down upon our winter camps, upon our women and children. Chato and his dogs do not care who suffers for their crimes. The revelation struck Selina with the force of a physical blow, inverting the entire narrative. The man on her table was not a vicious killer, but a lawman in his own right, condemned by the very prejudice he fought against. They trade what they steal. Dasan continued, his voice dropping low. Mules, rifles. They trade it all for more guns and for the whiskey that poisons their souls. From a white man. A white man? She pressed, leaning closer. Where is he? I do not know his name, Dasan admitted, sinking back, the effort costing him dearly. Only that he is powerful with many cattle. His brand. It is a circle that is broken. A broken circle. The image seared itself into Selina's mind, a cryptic symbol holding the key. Outside the siege was a boot on the throat of Redemption Gulch. Kane had effectively declared martial law. His deputies, led by the officious Pike, moved with arrogant authority, their searches rough and their questions sharp accusations. Sheriff Brody, his face flushed with indignation, had confronted the marshal to no avail. The threat of federal arrest hung over the town, and suspicion like a foul weed took root. In the all-night saloon. Black-eyed Susan served whiskey with a steady hand, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She watched Pike and another deputy drinking at a corner table. She'll crack by morning, Pike slurred, slamming his glass down. That dock's got no sand. Kane'll make an example of her. Susan wiped down their table, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. A shame, she commented idly. She saved my nephew from the croup last winter. She's harboring a redskin killer, the other deputy grunted. She gets what she deserves. Susan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as she turned away. She had lived in this territory a long time. She knew who owned which cattle spreads, who was getting rich while their neighbors struggled, and who had a reputation for cutting corners. She knew the brand of every major rancher in 100-mile radius, the Broken Circle. The name was on the tip of her tongue, a dangerous piece of knowledge. Back in the infirmary, a more immediate crisis was setting in. Their water was almost gone. The fever had left Dasan desperately dehydrated, and Selina's own throat was raw. She knew Kane's strategy was brutally effective. Thirst would break them long before bullets. The roof, Dasan whispered, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. There is a cistern behind the building. She knew the one he meant, a large wooden barrel under a downspout, likely full of stagnant water. But it was water. The alley behind the infirmary was dark, less heavily guarded than the front. It was a suicidal risk, but to sit here and slowly succumb to thirst was also suicide. Stay here, she commanded softly, taking the empty canteen. Don't make a sound. Moving with the silence of a ghost. Selina unlatched the scuttle hatch in the ceiling. Pushing it open a crack, she peered into the deep, star-dusted black of the Arizona night. Below, she could see the dark shape of the cistern. A single deputy stood guard 30 yards down the alley, his back to her. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hoisted herself through the hatch and crawled onto the gritty adobe roof, moving on her belly like a lizard. The rough surface scraped her hands and knees. She reached the back edge of the roof directly above the cistern. She had no rope. Thinking fast, she tore long strips from her petticoat, her fingers shaking as she tied the fabric together, testing each knot with a frantic prayer. She lowered the makeshift rope, the canteen dangling at its end. Inch by agonizing inch, she paid out the line until she felt the slight tug of it hitting water. Relief washed over her so potent it almost made her dizzy. Slowly, carefully, she began to haul the precious weight back up. The full canteen was heavy, and the knots in the flimsy fabric strained. Just as the canteen cleared the lip of the barrel, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, what was that sound?" The deputy. He'd heard the scrape. Selina froze, pressing herself flat against the roof, her breath catching in her lungs. She watched him turn and take a few steps toward the infirmary, peering into the shadows. "Probably just a coyote, Miller," another voice called lazily from the street. It was Pike. "Getting jumpy." The deputy Miller grunted. "Maybe." He hesitated for a long moment that felt like an eternity before turning and walking back to his post. Selina waited, her body rigid with terror, before pulling the canteen the rest of the way. She crawled back to the scuttle hatch and slid inside, sealing it. Leaning against the wall in the darkness, she clutched the full canteen to her chest. It was a small victory, but it was everything. She gave the water to Dasan first. As she took a sip herself, she knew they had bought another day. She had to use it. A soft, furtive scratching at the back door made her jump. It wasn't the heavy pounding of a deputy. "Dr. Parker," a boy's voice whispered. "It's me, Timothy O'Connell." Selina's eyes widened. She crept to the door. "Timothy, what are you doing? It's not safe." "I know," the boy whispered back, his voice tight with fear. "But Ma said I had to. She said you saved Pa's life, and we O'Connells pay our debts. She packed you some bread and jerky." A small cloth bundle was pushed under the door. Selina felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. In the midst of the town's fear, a spark of loyalty had endured. An idea desperate and dangerous formed in her mind. "Timothy," she whispered, "can you do something for me? Something secret and very important." "Yes, ma'am," he replied without hesitation. "I need you to take a note, not for me, but to stop more people from getting hurt. You cannot let anyone see you. Take it to Miss Susan at the saloon. Give it only to her." "I can do that." On the back of a prescription slip, Selina scribbled the two crucial words, "broken circle." She added a question mark and underlined it twice. Tying the note to a small rock, she pushed it through a grated ventilation shaft low on the wall. She heard Timothy scramble to retrieve it. A moment later, his faint footsteps disappeared into the night, a fragile, heroic echo in the oppressive silence. Now all they could do was wait. Wait for the sun. Wait for Cain's wrath. And wait to see if a saloon owner and a blacksmith's boy could unravel a conspiracy that a U.S. Marshal was too blind to see. Dawn broke with a hard, accusing glare over Redemption Gulch, illuminating a grim tableau, the ring of armed deputies, the splintered wood of the infirmary door, and the tense, watching eyes of the townspeople. Marshal Silas Cain stood in the center of the street, the picture of patient authority. He had given them the night. Now he would have his victory. "Dr. Parker," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Your time has expired. The games are over. Send out the Apache now, and I will take your cooperation into account when you are tried for treason." Inside the air was thick with desperation. Selina looked at Dasan, who held a knife in his good hand, not as a weapon of attack, but as a final grim assurance of his own end. "Do not let them take me alive, Shashandu," he whispered. "My spirit will not be caged." Selina's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the end of the line. Before she could shout a final useless refusal, a new sound cut through the tension. Two figures were approaching with a purposeful stride. Sheriff Brody, his face set with a new determination, and black-eyed Susan, her calm gait, a rebuke to the fear around her. Kane turned his face tightening with annoyance. "Sheriff, this is a federal matter. I advise you to return to your office before you are charged with obstruction." "It stopped being just a federal matter when you put my town in a stranglehold, Marshal," Brody said, his voice loud and steady. "This is a murder investigation, and I have new evidence. Evidence you might have found yourself if you weren't so busy laying siege to a doctor's office." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kane's eyes, cold as chips of ice, narrowed. "What evidence?" Susan stepped forward, holding up a small, heavy object in her palm. "Pike and another of your deputies got drunk in my saloon last night," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "One of them dropped this." She held the brass cartridge casing higher. "It's a 50-70 Sharps, Army issue once upon a time. Same heavy caliber that killed those Teamsters." Pike went pale. That's a swear I collect old casings," he stammered. "A fine story," Susan said with disdain. "The Army hasn't used that caliber in years, but you know who still loves them buffalo hunters. And certain powerful ranchers who like a rifle that can punch through a grizzly bear. Or a man." Kane waved a dismissive hand, though a flicker of doubt had entered his eyes. "A cartridge casing proves nothing." "On its own, maybe not," Brody shot back, "but it starts to paint a picture." His gaze swept past Kane and settled on a wealthy, imposing figure standing near the land office. "Isn't that right, Mr. Corbin?" Bartholomew Bart, Corbin, owner of the vast Broken Circle Ranch, straightened up. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff." "Don't you?" Brody pressed his voice, gaining strength. "Dr. Parker's patient, the man you want dead, told her his people were tracking renegades. Renegades who were selling stolen goods to a powerful white man whose brand was a broken circle." The collective gaze of the town shifted, settling on Corbin like a physical weight. He forced a brittle laugh. "That's utterly absurd. You're taking the word of a murdering savage over a respected citizen." "We are," said a new voice, solemn and resonant. The crowd parted as Father Michael walked slowly from the church, his Bible held against his chest. His presence brought a new, unassailable gravity to the proceedings. "Because one of Mr. Corbin's own ranch hands, a young man named Billy Lee, came to me for confession at first light. His conscience was a greater burden than his fear." The priest's words fell like stones into a silent pool. The mask of arrogant denial on Corbin's face began to crack. "The boy confessed," Father Michael continued, "that Mr. Corbin hired a band of Apache renegades to stage the raid. The Teamsters were never meant to be killed, but the renegades were drunk on whiskey that Mr. Corbin himself supplied. He wanted the raid blamed on the local Chiricahua to have them driven off the lands bordering his own. The entire ugly conspiracy was laid bare. It was never about justice. It was about greed." Marshal Kane stared his face, a thundercloud of conflicting emotions. He had been played. He, the great finisher, had been made a pawn in a common land grab. The humiliation was a poison burning in his veins. Corbin saw the game was up. His eyes, like those of a cornered wolf, darted around, seeking an escape that didn't exist. His hand drifted down to the custom-made Colt revolver at his hip. Lies, all of it. A conspiracy to ruin me. Then why? Sheriff Brody asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Did Billy Lee tell me you paid the renegades with 3 new Sharps rifles? And why did I find a box of 50-70 cartridges in your saddlebags this morning, identical to the one Pike dropped? That was the final damning nail. Corbin didn't bother with another denial. He moved. His hand was a blur as it snatched the revolver from its holster. His face contorted with spiteful rage, he aimed at the infirmary door. "If I'm going down," he roared, "that redskin is going down with me." He fired. The heavy slug tore through the weakened wood of the door with a deafening crack. Inside, Selina screamed as the bullet ripped past her head, burying itself in the adobe wall. The shot shattered the standoff. It was the tipping point. Marshal Kane moved with shocking speed, his pistol materializing in his hand. But in that split second, as his instinct screamed at him to neutralize the threat, his entire rigid world view fractured. He saw Corbin's treachery, he saw the priest's truth, and he saw his own blind, arrogant folly. The law he served had been perverted. Justice demanded a rebalancing of the scales. He turned and fired a single shot, not at Corbin, but into the dirt at the feet of his own deputy. "Stand down!" Kane bellowed, his voice the roar of a wounded lion. "All of you stand down!" His men froze, shocked and confused. Corbin seized the moment. He fired again at the infirmary, then spun and bolted for the livery stable. 2 of his ranch hands drew their weapons and fired into the street, providing cover and sending the townspeople screaming for safety. Pandemonium erupted. Inside the infirmary, the second bullet had galvanized Dasan. He saw Corbin escaping. A lifetime of warrior instinct took over. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved the heavy examination table aside, threw the bolt, kicked the splintered door open, and emerged into the blinding sunlight. His knife held low and ready. He ignored the deputies, ignored the chaos. His eyes were locked on Corbin. Kane saw him emerge, and for a fraction of a second, the old instinct flared. But he choked it down, his mind replaying the priest's confession. He hesitated. That hesitation was all Dasan needed. He sprinted his wounded body, protesting with every stride, his will pure iron. He cut across the street, a silent, deadly shadow. Corbin reached his horse and was swinging into the saddle when Dasan hit him, tackling him with the force of a striking panther and driving him to the ground. Corbin's gun went skittering across the dust. The 2 ranch hands turned their fire on the struggling men, but before they could aim, a deafening boom erupted from the saloon doorway. Black-eyed Susan stood there, a sawed-off shotgun braced against her hip, smoke curling from one of its barrels. One of the ranch hands cried out and clutched his leg, collapsing. The other, seeing Sheriff Brody and Marshal Kane advancing on him, threw his gun down in surrender. The gunfight was over. In the sudden ringing silence, all eyes turned to the middle of the street. Dasan stood over the sputtering, defeated form of Bart Corbin. He held his knife to the cattle baron's throat. The entire town held its breath, expecting the savage vengeance they had been taught to anticipate. But Dasan did not kill him. He looked from Corbin's terrified face to Selina standing in the infirmary doorway. He looked at Marshal Kane, whose face was an unreadable canvas of awe and shame. With a final look of contempt, Dasan pulled his knife away, stood, and kicked Corbin's discarded pistol away into the dust. He had not been hunting for vengeance. He had been hunting for justice. He walked back toward the infirmary, his duty done. He stopped a few feet from Marshal Kane, meeting his gaze with the quiet dignity of a man who had been vindicated. Kane holstered his pistol, the sound sealing the end of an era. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet and heavy, "put Mr. Corbin in irons. He's a federal prisoner now." The siege of Redemption Gulch was over. The truth unearthed by the courage of a few had finally explosively come to light. In the aftermath, the silence that fell over Redemption Gulch was not one of fear, but of profound reassessment. The townspeople looked at each other and the key figures of the siege as if seeing them for the first time. The simple lines of their world had been redrawn. Bart Corbin and his men were locked in the town jail, their downfall a stark testament to the morning's explosive truths. Later that afternoon, Marshal Kane appeared at Selina's open door. He held his hat in his hands, his iron authority replaced by a humility that seemed to cost him dearly. Sheriff Brody stood a few paces behind a silent witness to this monumental shift. "My investigation was compromised by prejudice," Kane stated, his voice low but clear for both Selina and Dasan to hear. "You upheld your oath, Doctor, when I nearly broke mine. You have my respect." He then looked directly at Dasan, who rested on the cot. "The charges are dropped. You are a free man. My official report will exonerate your tribe completely and name Corbin and the Narke Delan as the guilty parties. You will have a federal escort back to your territory." It was not an apology, but something more significant, an admission of truth from a man who had only ever dealt in facts. Dasan gave a single slow nod of acknowledgement. Justice hard won and overdue had been served. The next morning, Dasan prepared to ride out. Selina met him by his horse, pressing a small pouch of herbs and clean bandages into his hand. Their farewell was quiet, the understanding between them deeper than words. "You have a strong heart, Shashandu," he said, using the Apache term for doctor woman. "You stood for a man you did not know. My people will not forget this." "I stood for what was right, Dasan," she replied softly. "That is all." He reached out, not to shake her hand, but to gently touch her bruised shoulder, where the rifle had kicked her, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the price of their stand. Then he mounted, gave one last look at the woman in the infirmary doorway, and rode out a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, shimmering heat of his homeland. Selina Parker never saw him again. Life in Redemption Gulch found a new footing. Selina was no longer an outsider. She was the town's fierce protective heart, her loyalty repaid in kind by all she had helped. Sheriff Brody walked with a new authority, his easy nature now backed by the steel of conviction. Even the legend of Marshal Kane transformed. Tales of his relentlessness were now forever tempered by the story of a man who learned the hard difference between law and justice in a dusty town he almost broke. And the story itself grew as frontier legends do. In retellings around campfires, Selina's single shot became a dozen, and Dasan a phantom warrior who fought off 20 men. But the core of the tale, the truth of it, remained untouched. It was the story of courage overpowering fear and of integrity standing against brute force. Selina Parker remained in Redemption Gulch, healing the sick and delivering new life into the world. She never sought recognition, but the legend was now part of her. Strangers would look at the quiet doctor with a sense of wonder, seeing not just a physician, but a living testament to the fact that the most enduring battles of the West were sometimes fought not with a gun, but with unwavering conviction. And so the legend of Dr. Selina Parker and the wounded Apache became woven into the very fabric of the Arizona Territory. It serves as a powerful reminder that history isn't just shaped by famous generals and gunslingers, but by the extraordinary courage of ordinary people in impossible situations. It's a story about looking past prejudice to find the truth, and about how one person's refusal to back down can change the course of lives and challenge the conscience of a nation. The Wild West was won not just with rifles and railroads, but with moments of profound integrity, just like this one. If this story of frontier courage moved you, and you believe these tales of honor and grit deserve to be told, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more legends from the dusty trails of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for